Ab. I am the SDG and Impact Program Lead at Unify, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to this closing session of this year's European Regional Roundtable of Unify. As we close this year's event, we were very keen to reflect on one more trend that has emerged over the last year, and which we thought was very significant and also reflected very recently in the context of COP26. And that is an evolution and the emergence of a mood, really, and a will from leading initiatives to collaborate and to converge around what might start to emerge as a more coherent system of norms, guidance for sustainability management. As this area has bloomed over the years, we've been blessed with having many new initiatives on how to manage impact, how to disclose, and that has certainly been a blessing, but we've also heard many calls for clarity, as some people have referred to what is a little bit of a fragmented landscape. Last week on Finance Day of COP, an announcement was made regarding the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which in a number of respects starts to respond perhaps to some of those issues of fragmentation. And so today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a distinguished panel to explore this topic a little bit more, of what a system of norms for sustainability impact management might look like, and the progress we might make in this direction. Today, with me on this panel is Clara Berby from the Impact Management Project. Clara has also been heading for the last year the Sustainability Reporting Project of the IFRS, which culminated precisely in the announcement last week of the formation of the ISSB. Also today here is Tony Balabriga, who is Global Head of Responsible Business at BBVA, and is also co-chair of Unify's Global Steering Committee. We have with us as well, of course, Eric Usher, head of Unify, and Sheila, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at PRI. So very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this closing session. I'd like to kick off with yourselves, Tony and Sheila. Why don't we start off by just doing a bit of a recap and rehearsing what some of the challenges are relating to what has indeed been this blossoming of the sustainable finance, sustainable business, impact management space, and the multiple initiatives, standards, guidance that has flourished. Perhaps I could turn to you, Tony, first to give us a perspective of what sort of challenges that means for practitioners in the banking space. And Sheila, perhaps from your end, you could then reflect on some of the challenges this represents specifically from an investor perspective.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the invitation to this very relevant panel about impact. It's a great pleasure to be here, share our perspective as a bank. Well, first of all, let me tell you that at BBVA, in our latest responsible banking policy, approved 1 year ago, includes two very important principles regarding today's conversation. No? The first one is in line with the second PRB, and that BBVA is geared toward generating a positive impact in society. So we understand that responsible banking must be in everything we do in our business. In this regard, the bank will take into consideration the direct and indirect impact in the more relevant areas that its business and activities could have on its stakeholders, promoting positive impacts and attempting to reduce the negative ones. No? And the second principle is our involvement as an agent of social change. The bank, we say, will get involved along with other stakeholders as agents of change, with the aspiration of creating opportunities for everyone, dedicating our skills, corporate knowledge, capabilities, and resources to this aim. No? So, relating to the impact management, we face 4 key important challenges, no? Links to these 2 principles. No? The first one is about, well, the lack of consistency, no? About the scope. We have the SASB focusing, well, till now only on financial impact for the company. The double materiality approach promoted by the European Union. And now we have the dynamic materiality as defined by the IFRS Foundation. Now with the ISSB, no? We focus on enterprise value. No? In our case, we really support the double materiality approach. No? We understand that here's the way to introduce impact outward in the new global standard that will lead by the new ISSB through its dynamic vision, recognizing that some of the sustainable impacts can also become material for the enterprise value creation gradually or rapidly. No? In fact, I think that this what has happened with the first prototype released last week, no, by the Technical Readiness Working Group, in line with the TCFD, no, where we can see metrics of CO2 emissions and also targets that must be disclosed. No, so in our opinion, I think that this will be the case also for other critical sustainability topics like natural capital, where we have a lot of companies with high dependency from natural capital, or social issues, no, as well. No? So first is the scope. The second challenge is the reporting burden and the difference among jurisdictions, combining mandatory and voluntary reports. No? It is clear that we have an alphabet soup of standards and norms. We really need to converge, no, to promote consistency, comparability, and data quality. No? The third challenge we face as banks is about also precisely about this lack of consistency in measurement methodologies. No? A good example, I think, is, for instance, the implied temperature portfolio methodologies that are being used in some financial institutions, providing different results sometimes to the same portfolio. In banking, we also have this problem when we try to attribute CO2 emissions to our credit portfolio, depending if we use information at a corporate level or at an asset level. No, so this is a key challenge as well. And the last one is about data availability, no? Especially in those jurisdictions with lower mandatory reporting requirements. For instance, for us, a bank that we generate practically 2/3 of our gross income from emerging countries, this is really an additional challenge. No? In fact, in our case, we have overcome this lack of data using sometimes a specific service. This is the case that we have done with our BBA Microfinance Foundation, with our performance report that I think, humbly think that is probably the best impact report of a microfinance institution, private micro institution worldwide, including metrics about our clients, about business growth, about financial health, about welfare of our clients. So I think these are the four most relevant challenges for a bank. We cannot hear you, Karen, sorry.
Apologies. Just saying thank you, Tony, and handing over to Sheila for your thoughts from the investor perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much, Corinne. Thanks for having us. I guess from our experience working with signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investment, there are definitely particular challenges for different types of investors. And I might group them into three areas. So first, there are those investors that are currently needing to navigate the new and emerging regulatory frameworks in this space. That's not the case for all of our signatories, but for an increasing number of them. So they're needing to understand the specific requirements. And as Tony indicated, looking for specific data to match those particular demands for reporting and disclosure. They also might be looking to gauge where and how current voluntary frameworks are likely to shape future regulation, as we already see how that's been playing out. And their needs are quite specific because they need to ensure they have the capabilities and resources now to respond to those existing and emerging requirements. In terms of a second area, there are also some investors that are looking for much more in-depth tools and guidance that can support them to focus on very specific impact areas that they have prioritized, and in some cases as they apply to specific asset classes. So, you know, in this case, their activities to shape specific sustainability outcomes may be more driven by client demand or beneficiary preferences rather than near-term regulatory developments. So they may have more flexibility in the approach that they take, but their needs are quite particular because they often need much more advanced and sophisticated tools and even more granular levels of data. This is also a space where you have a different focus in terms of accountability. So you have perhaps wider civil society or other groups that are focusing on the robustness of activities in those areas that may be different than when there's a response to a regulatory demand. And we really see that in the emerging voluntary reporting around net zero commitments. And then the third area is really those investors that are still questioning how far they're permitted to go in terms of shaping sustainability outcomes. And again, as the PRI and often working with Unipify, we're working with this group of investors with a different set of resources to support them to take the first steps in seeking to have impact on people and the planet. And I would argue, therefore, that given this diversity of demand and, perhaps, I don't know if it's it's not the right thing to say, but I think that given the consolidation of tools and frameworks is going to take some time, I think we really need to provide support in the meantime for those different groups of investors because they're facing really different challenges. But I would note that in parallel, we can also seek to drive alignment, I think particularly in terms of terminology and definitions and continuing to make the case in different forums for a building block approach that will enable consolidation over the longer term. So I think it's this combination of specific support to specific investors who are at different phases of their journey on this, while in parallel supporting the longer term consolidation.
Thank you so much, Sheila. So I think it's a nuanced panorama really in terms of, yes, a lot of very noisy environment of many things happening, many frameworks around, and some things indeed requiring a little bit more alignment, but also a reality that the audience is very diverse and that there will be different resources needed to address different needs indeed. And so interesting developments definitely over the last year and announced last week in particular, but so much more needed. You literally just have, in a couple of words, each of you, if there was one thing in particular, I'd say, that would be what's needed to kind of get the picture together. Sheila, you mentioned, definitions and some of the key building blocks. Anything in particular? And Tony, would you have anything to add to that before we move on?
No, I mean, yes, we welcome the initiative of last week of the International Sustainability Standard Board. We also welcome the work done by the EFRAG at European level in this regard. No? But beyond these regulatory initiatives, we really also appreciate efforts done through other self-regulation initiatives, such as the one led by the World Economic Forum with the ESG metrics initiative, in order to have an holistic approach to what is today in the market. Well, an initiative that we also support at BBA, and we have planned to incorporate not only the core, but also the extended metrics in the next report, practically 90% of them. And also other initiatives like the one we have at Unipify, with the portfolio impact assessment tool focusing on banks, which I strongly recommend, seeing the second updated version released in April, because it is a key tool to help banks to implement the impact principle of the PRP. What is needed? What is more needed? Well, I think that we really need convergence. Convergence and maybe a one-stop shop to have all the resources available, updated and connected to avoid overlapping and help companies in their selection and implementation. That will be my wish.
Sheila, how do you feel about that? Very much hearing your point on we have very diverse needs as well. So what's that right balance, or how do you feel about this notion of a landing point?
Well, I guess specifically with regards to the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board and the prototype that was launched last week, we obviously warmly welcome these developments. It's exactly sort of these steps that are needed in terms of consolidation. It's also exactly the steps that are needed in terms of this building block approach. I think the key next is really about jurisdictions collaborating to create this global baseline for sustainability reporting, and also really for the scope of the standard to be extended from material risks and opportunities, building, let's say, much more on a climate lens or an environmental issues lens, to one that's applicable to a much wider range of sustainability issues, and with a clear outcomes perspective. So that's what we would be calling for from that perspective. I think otherwise, what we would be expecting in terms of the support and what we would be looking to provide in terms of support to investors that are in those, let's say, different camps, is going to be tools to help them navigate new regulatory requirements, how they can understand the connections between those to the voluntary frameworks, guidance on specific areas of focus in terms of shaping sustainability outcomes, in terms of guidance around capital allocation, mandate design, guidance for stewardship of investees, support with engagement with key stakeholders, and then I guess, yes, as with everyone else in this space, more in-depth tools and access to data. And I would say just recognizing that those sources of information are often emerging in a space that's particularly focused maybe on a subset of issues, and so acting as a conduit of that information from those very in-depth forums and initiatives to kind of the higher level information and data that might be needed by a broader subset of investors.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks, Tony. I think that takes us to the second part of our discussion. I mean, Clara, obviously you've been, as mentioned before, just through your title, clearly very much in this effort of trying to bring coordination to some of the main pieces of the puzzle. Perhaps you'd like to share a little bit of information around what the Impact Management Project has done in gathering a structured network of such initiatives, why that came together, and how that fits into the landscape that Tony and Sheila have just described, and how you see that going forward as a first step. And then we'll come to Eric as well.
Absolutely, Corinne, and I'm glad to follow Tony and Sheila, because the frustrations that you have shared in terms of what more we need to do were the impetus for the IMP beginning in the first place. And I think we've just taken some steps along the path to solving for what you've described, and there's more to do. Now, the reason that we started taking those steps was because we felt the same frustrations you've articulated, but recognized that there's probably three things that required a common place for everyone to talk. And by everyone, I mean the organizations, the initiatives, who had either voluntarily or with support from different constituencies taken it upon themselves to provide principles, standards, guidance in the area of how companies manage their sustainability matters. And the reason why we thought there needed to be a forum, a place for all of those initiatives to talk, was three main reasons. The first one was that it was really clear, and I'm thinking of the nuances that you expressed, Sheila, that there are certainly nuances in terms of how market practitioners come at the conversation of how they manage their sustainability matters, and that there is a community who has come from a risk management perspective. There is a community who has come from an intentional, I want to solve the problems of people and planet perspective, whether it's corporates or investors or other types of organization. But actually, when it came to the data, for example, that those practitioners needed, the nuanced path they took to get there didn't necessarily mean they needed a different data set. What it often meant was that they were looking for a different performance on that data set. And so we thought that it was incredibly important that the initiatives looking at this from those different pathways had a common dialogue about where actually the metrics, as an example, they were working on were necessarily the same, and made sure that we didn't have unnecessary nuances that really affect, for example, the banks who were looking at serving different constituencies. So that was one reason. The second reason was a recognition that the initiatives were often also looking at this from the perspective of different stakeholder types. And that's really organic and obvious, that often initiatives crop up because a certain group of constituencies have said, this is really important to us, will you convene us? And they necessarily get together with their peers. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean when it comes to issues like metrics that you're looking at different metrics for different types of constituencies. And so we felt it was really important to have a common dialogue for that reason too, with different initiatives serving different stakeholders. And the final reason was a recognition, and I'm going to use the analog of the financial system because I have found that very helpful to think about. You know, in finance, we don't confuse the P&L, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement with each other, and nor do we confuse financial accounting with financial analysis and with the techniques and tools that we use to do financial analysis, and nor do we confuse those with benchmarks, for example. When it comes to thinking about all of the principles, standards, guidance, and benchmarks you need for managing your sustainability matters as an organization, the same is true. It's not that you need just one thing. You necessarily need a system of different tools. What's critical is that it's coherent and they fit together, because very often there is a relationship between the different tools. And so that was the third reason we wanted to convene initiatives, because we recognized they were in many cases tackling different parts of an overall system that was needed, but there wasn't coherence between them. So Corinne, that's the origin of the effort, and it is an effort that needs to continue.
Yeah. Thanks, Claire, and perhaps, you know, on that note, perhaps you could just elaborate on, you know, in terms of those around the table. Actually, two organizations on the panel today are part of that structured network, so PRI and Unify, but obviously there were many others, the Global Compact, IFC, GIN, the disclosure frameworks such as GRI and SASB and IRC, even though we now have different acronyms to go by as those have been consolidated. But perhaps you'd like to reflect on, you know, some of the successes or some of the things that have managed to actually consolidate and clarify what, you know, some of the work has been, to illustrate to those who may be not so familiar with it, and how that ties into some of what's been announced last week. Great. Yes, I mean, I said we've taken some steps and there's more to do. It would be nice to reflect on the steps we have taken. It's a really good point, Corinne, because there are two things, I think, which are very meaningful from the perspective of practitioners. The first one, I'm actually not going to talk about last week. I'm going to talk about next week briefly. And it's to say that one of the things that has come out of this network, the structured dialogue between the initiatives, is the beginning of a description of that overall system. What are the different actions that organizations need to take when they're managing their sustainability impacts? And then what are the different principles, guidance, standards they might need for each of those actions, and how do they relate to each other? And it's not easy to explain all of that, but I think that the work between all of you has been fantastic at getting to something that is far simpler than anything I've seen before about how practitioners can engage with a coherent system. So I'll let Eric talk more about that, but it's that dialogue alone, I think, will be significantly helpful for anyone who is perhaps less familiar with this. We need the gateway for people to come to this and not use the excuse of, it's an alphabet soup, I don't know where to start, therefore I'm not going to do it. I think that the effort so far, Corinne, has taken a good stab at solving for that problem. The second one is last week. The ISSB was announced by the IFRS Foundation. And I think a couple of observations I would make as to why I think it is incredibly important as a symbol of collaboration, or to use the word that was used before, convergence. The first reason is that it was pretty clear to me from a lot of engagement with regulators that often regulation comes when there's a sufficient understanding that there's a center of gravity to support. And I think what happened over the course of this year is clearly there was the demand from the market. It was the first time I've seen the market ask the regulators to do something. It's usually the other way around. And there was clearly the demand from the market. But when the regulators felt comfortable moving, and by this I mean the dialogue happening at the level of IOSCO as they convened the different authorities responsible for corporate reporting, it was clear that there was something that could be done, because for the first time all of the initiatives in this area that focused on disclosure started to speak with one voice about a comprehensive corporate reporting system, and actually went so far as to call on IOSCO and the IFRS Foundation to play a consolidating role.
The other reason I think it was really significant is that, as you said, Karine, two of the organizations that we were working with, SASB and IARC, then merged. And then as of last week, those two plus the CDSB committed to merge into the new board. That kind of leadership you don't often see. M&A is not that common in the world of nonprofit initiatives. And for me, it's very powerful, because what it shows is people's ability to say, yes, we've come at this problem with our own mental model, our own framework. And those are incredibly addictive. We should be honest about that. People have spent a long time crafting the way that they slice and dice these things. We're prepared to put that into a melting pot together to come out with the simplest, best possible standards for the market. And that, for me, was an inspiration that I think we need to carry forward with us into this next phase.
Thanks so much, Clara. And Eric, I think it's probably time for us to share with the audience some of Unipify's involvement in this process, and how it's relevant, hopefully, to the membership and what we're doing at Unipify. So please, hand over to you.
Thanks, Karine, and thanks, Sheila, and Tony and Clara. To come in from the Unify side, I think, as many people are aware, our mandate is to work with different parts of the financial industry on essentially how do we embed ESG or sustainability factors into financial practice, and the main frameworks for that being the PRI, the PSI for insurance, and the PRB. I think, coming out of Paris 6 years ago, it kind of supercharged the notion of risk and an opportunity around green finance, climate, which has been good to get things going. But we really see now an inflection point, and risk obviously is key and it will continue to be. But opportunity, there's a problem with that notion, because it sounds like you're adding on something at the margins. And what we know is, if we're going to address climate change or the other global challenges, it's not about just an add-on. It's really about the core business that we do as investors, as banks, and as everyone in the private sector. So really, we're seeing this inflection more towards a notion of, well, I would say adding on the notion of particularly risk, but to a notion of impact and alignment. And that it's a newer notion, because the PRB was drafted just 2 years ago. It's baked into the PRB. It's the center of the principles of responsible banking. It's also, when you look at things like work we do with the PRI, for instance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, it's really at the center of net zero. Although even if it's not said as such, when you dig into it, it's about alignment. What does it mean to identify impact and to align with something, there being the net zero trajectory? And therefore, I think the uptake has been quite remarkable. I think it's moved faster than maybe any of us would have expected. And certainly last week, Finance Day, I think, was a bringing together of many aspects of that. And I would say obviously the GFANZ is a very powerful mobilization. The fact that FSB is expecting that it will be reported into, which is really important in terms of the regulatory signal. But the launch of IFRS, the ISSB, incredibly important. And I think, as Clara just said, the actual convergence for me was almost the most important part of that announcement, because it's exactly for the reasons Clara said, is the alphabet soup, we are seeing a convergence, which is going to try to bring that together, as so many know is needed, but it doesn't necessarily happen on its own. And I think here, because of the many bodies involved, standard setters have realizing that really, if we're going to solve this problem, we're going to have to do it together, including working together. So in terms of the structured network, where it comes in, I think ISSB is going to be critically important, that everybody in the private sector is going to know. Now impact accounting is going to sit alongside financial accounting. It's going to be as important. It's the double materiality, or some still would say the dynamic materiality, but its place is there, lodged within essentially the workings of the private sector. We know standard setters don't happen overnight in terms of, well, the formation sends an important signal. The actual standards are going to take time. And I think probably they need to take time to get it right. But there's a lot of need essentially to, I don't know, we call it the sandbox, or what it is to basically work together on common approaches. And the structured network, and now with the working together to launch the next phase of the IMP, now to be called the Impact Management Platform, I think is really that body, which is how can we get standard and norm setters together to be working on developing common practice. So we're not propagating the alphabet soup, we're actually trying to bring sense to it, to come up with common approaches, admitting that impact, disclosure, and management is not a simple topic. And looking in climate, it's complicated enough. But then when we climb out of climate, we look at other, nature loss, social issues. There's a lot of ambiguities there. And we're working with the banking, insurance, investment leaders on this, and they will very quickly say, as many in the audience will say, that this is not a simple solution that we're going to get right away. We need basically the support within the private sector to start to develop best practice, to test it, to get feedback, to essentially work together, to lean in. I think, as Clara said, the relationship with the regulators is, let's not expect regulators to regulate to get things going from the beginning. Let's build this relationship. Let's show how you do that. Let's build the credibility. Net zero, how credible is it? Well, the private sector should show that it's credible, should show the common practice in a way that regulators can watch, like with TCFD, and say, okay, this is making sense. The breadth of disclosures has really expanded. That's fantastic. But the depth is not quite there yet. We need to actually start to weigh in. And the NGFS has done a fantastic work to try to start to now, I would say, ratchet up in terms of on the climate disclosures. We need that relationship between market leaders in the private sector and regulators. And I think the structured network and the impact management platform is really a place where the multilaterals and the other standard norm setters can start to develop those, work with leaders in the private sector to get best practice approach, that then the ISSB, I think, will look very seriously at how do you then integrate that into a standard setting means, and regulators as well will be able to learn from that. It's going to be launched in the coming weeks on the 17th of November, if I have the date right. UNIP-FI, we're very pleased to be co-chairing the initiative alongside OECD, and it brings in a whole group of multilaterals and other key actors to develop these processes together in consultation with our members, going across the financial sector and industry. Let's see how we can get this right. It's not everything's going to work the first time. There needs to be a testing phase. There needs to be sort of the sand flinging phase to build the castles, and then the ones that make sense, well, I think will really start to gel, and that's essentially what this community is about.
Thanks, Eric. And you mentioned, the multilaterals specifically a number of times, and I think where the UN in particular, perhaps, but indeed the international organizations often looked towards for guidance when it comes to sustainability topics, and having an authoritative view, right, on what is right, what is needed, what are thresholds, from the more general to the very technical. And so I don't know if you'd like to reflect on the very specific role, indeed, that you think multilaterals are going to take. I mean, obviously, UNIP-FI, OECD, both co-chairing this platform, but in general taking quite an important role. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I mean, just to say, the notion of impact and two phases. One is, expectations on disclosure around impact. So the second, materiality, but then the notion of impact management. What does it mean to actually try to make improvements in terms of positive impact or addressing areas of negative impact? I don't think there's any organization today around the world, public or private, who really knows how exactly to do this in all ways. I mean, I think there's a lot of expertise that's out there, and in some parts of the sector, the private sector or the financial sector, there is a lot of expertise in certain aspects of it. But the reality is we don't have the solutions that are needed in all ways. And therefore, I think the multilaterals, like an OECD, has a very important role in sharing, in sort of bringing maybe credibility around certain aspects of practice, but they also have limitations. And we'd say that on the UN side, absolutely as well. So bringing in the different areas of expertise, including from the World Bank Group and IFC, including from the UN, including from the development program and other parts within the UN family, and then with the more specialized, the SASBs, the GIN, and the other. So it's really, I think, about bringing the expertise and pooling it and trying to, partly from, I say, the inspiration of the ISSB is how can we get convergence of practice so that, best practice can be something which is that the leaders in the private sector can apply and test out, and then can also be providing the feedback needed to improve over time.
Thank you. Yeah, and to that notion of pooling expertise and that mix between multilaterals and other technical pools of expertise, it's interesting to see that also in the context of the ISSB, there's a similar logic that's been put into place with the stakeholder consultative committee that will be advising the ISSB on the technical aspects of sustainability and indeed how that intersects with enterprise value, where multilateral entities are holding obviously a key role, but will be accompanied by a series of other technical entities as well. Well, thank you very much for the insights, Eric. I think we're in the final phase of the session, and so the announcement is made effectively in terms of a coming together through the impact management platform of the entities to really continue the effort that was started under the structured network and really brilliantly facilitated by the IMP Impact Management Project. So apologies for confusion on acronyms right now, and to you in particular, Clara. And so I think there's a feeling on behalf of the organisations around the table for the impact management platform that there is a very rich inheritance, but also a lot to do. And so perhaps it would just be interesting to go around the table one last time in terms of what do each of you think might be some of the top priorities for the platform going forward? What was some of the first things we ought to focus on? We can go around as we started. Tony, Sheila?
Yeah. No, I mean, we strongly welcome this new initiative, the Impact Management Platform. And we will be ready to work with the platform, obviously. So that's great news. General requests that are already comment about this connectivity, how all the frameworks that are methodologies and data and metrics that are there, how we can connect them. I think two very specific requests. I mean, one is use the platform, I think, as a great platform for use cases on considering the different needs of the different organizations and how to promote these conversions through focusing on use cases, in order to simplify and help in implementing. And the second one is what is already mentioned. It is critical, a very close engagement with the ISSB to provide input on those sustainability impact metrics and topics that I am sure that will come beyond climate, when they start to work on other environmental topics or social topics. We are sure that the expertise about impact metrics that are relevant should be provided by this platform. So I think it's very important to make this work in this one-stop shop.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the opportunities from the platform have been mentioned. We're also very excited to see this work continue and to be part of it. I think, Eric's analogy of the sandbox is really is right. Obviously, there could be very specific work streams and I guess directional work that we would do together. I think also, though, having it as a place to land where, even if it's not planned, that there's a space where you can bring perhaps, more advanced practice or emerging needs that you didn't have sight of before, and that that there's a forum and the group of the right actors at the table who, instead of facing these challenges individually, can work to tackle them together. I think is really exciting. I mean, there's some sort of more banal challenges but that actually without these types of actors together, we can't solve them. Corinne, and you and I talked about this the other day, but not everyone gets excited about this. I get quite sometimes excited and incensed about industry classifications. I mean, we need to look at revising them and aligning them. It's all of this infrastructure that we need in the background, and that actually, these have been internationally agreed. And unless you get the right actors at the table to call for change and to work on solutions, it's not going to happen. And then I think, again, it's the same group as well. We have goals that we have really managed to translate into expectations for and by investors. On climate, we've seen that happen. So we know it's possible, but we've got to do it, as Tony has said and others have said, on other issues. And, it's kind of working through them together over time, learning from how, the experience on certain issues. Obviously, it's not one for one on environmental issues versus social issues, but really trying to speed up that process from learning on how that, knowing we have done it and seeing that it's possible to do it, over time on multiple issues. And again, unless you have these groups working together, it's not going to happen at the speed that's needed or the rigor that's required. So yeah, we very much welcome it.
Eric, thoughts from your end? I'd love to give Clara the final word, just because she's been so much in the center of the getting us to the platform, that I'd love her to be able to have the last word.
So maybe I can set that up, because I would like to take the opportunity to thank a person who's moved mountains, and that is Clara. Clara, you brought us together several years ago into the original structured network in the IMP in its first version. I think at that time, nobody thought that the announcement from the IFRS that happened last week would happen, at least in our lifetimes. Maybe a bit cynical there, but it's amazing the progress that's happened. And
I was told it wouldn't happen, Eric, so you're not too cynical.
And then your role, both in convening us, but then in going and basically working with the IFRS to establish ISSB is very incredible. And I think it's a nice, great example of how one person can bring together and corral and goad and entice and whatever it takes, carrots and sticks. But it's been a true impressive accomplishment. And I guess the reality is we're just at the starting gates now. The job is not done. But Clara, you've done a wonderful job to line us up, and we're looking forward to continuing that work together.
Eric, thank you. And I will probably not unsurprisingly say that in all of these things, there's always a whole web of people who make things happen. So I feel it has been an enormous effort by many leaders. And I guess, Corinne, I do want to double down on industry classification, Sheila, by the way. Before I get into the wider comments, I want to double down on industry classification, and I want to flag transition plans. There are some areas that still need serious collaboration to get to something that everyone can say, okay, I can't use confusion as an excuse anymore. But I guess I do want to come back to the point you were making, Eric, because I think that this next phase is going to require incredible people leadership. As I said before, people's mental models for thinking about this practice are very addictive to them. They've come at this from a particular place, often invested in it deeply. And it is going to take some leadership to get people to think above that and see that actually, let's not confuse mission with organization. Let's focus on mission, and that it's going to take all of you to do it. So I guess my closing comment is, is that I think that it's in the right hands going forward, and it's going to take all of you to make it happen. The final thing I want to say is a note of optimism. Sheila, it comes to a point that you made. Last week, the IFRS, when it announced the board to provide substance as well, provided these prototypes that Sheila has referenced to show what recommendations from the existing players look like to give the board that running start. There is actually a second prototype. It's less sexy as a name. It's general requirements. It's not climate. But I really encourage everyone to look at it, because what it does is commit the IFRS to sustainability broadly from day one. And it says, we recognize we haven't given you the full-blown standard for every single sustainability topic, but we're going to give you the general requirements here that says, if you use this structure, you don't really have an excuse not to report on any sustainability information that's material for global capital markets. And so I encourage people to look at that, because I think, Sheila, it sets this up for success. Ultimately, it will be the board that is going to make the decisions, but it's a good sign at the start. And going to your sandbox, Eric, the more that sandbox effort works and the more coherence there is coming out of you all to advise the board, I think the quicker we're going to see the general requirements become a whole library that we need.
Thank you very, very much for those words, Clara. And indeed, I think there's a lot for us to still work on, and the bridges have been set up between the different efforts in such a way that hopefully we can progress and build on the excellent work that started. We're pretty much at time, so I'd like to thank you all for being here today on this session. And I just close by giving the the audience the references of the launch itself for the impact management platform. So the website and the announcement of the platform will be released on the 17th of November next week, and you will find that very much featuring on all of the the web pages of the partners. So definitely Unify, PRI, and others that we've mentioned today. And then there will be an actual launch webinar on the 23rd of November that will be initiated by Inga Anderson, Executive Director of UNEP, and Matthias Kormann, Executive Director at OECD. And there will be a couple of panel discussions following that, where the partners reflect basically on some of the topics that they will be focusing on going forward, and the way that we're hoping to make progress and to build on what has already started. So please do join the webinar. I believe on your screens you should be seeing a link to already find more information about the webinar and register. So thank you very much for joining today. My pleasure on this note to close the session and close the roundtable. Thank you very much again to our speakers with us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.